Hello out there, fellow YouTubians. Here I am with another spontaneous essay. My life is rather complicated, and I am constantly running to and fro to Jerusalem and back, and as a result I don't get many chances to sit down and talk to people and do my spontaneous essays or my Yiddish lessons, which are broadcast on a different channel. Anyway, here I am finally with some free time. So let's talk about a topic which has been pretty hot in the news lately, and that is anti-Semitism. Now, one of the freshman congressmen in the United States, one Ilhan Omar, has said some various things that are anti-Israel and that are also anti-Semitic, some both, some only one way. And like many anti-Semitic people, she hides behind critical comments about Israel to claim that that's all she's doing, but really it's not. Saying that Jews only care about their Benjamins, that's anti-Semitism. You're saying something about Jews. Saying that Jews have dual loyalty and are not really loyal Americans, that's an old anti-Semitic canard that's gone through a lot of changes. It used to be that they would say that Jews stick together. Then Jews are conspiring against Christians or Muslims, whoever happens to be making the charge. And then that there's an international conspiracy of Jews. And then we got our own country here in Israel, paid for in blood, sweat, and tears, and suffering. And then it becomes Jews are really loyal to Israel, unless they're outright anti-Israel. And, well, let's not muddy the waters by discussing these canards in detail, but those are anti-Semitic canards. Now, the Democratic caucus came up with a very wishy-washy condemnation of her statements, one that did not mention her by name, and that did not even single out anti-Semitism, just spoke about every kind of intolerance, whether racism, homophobia, lactose intolerance, or also anti-Semitism. And that was the best that the Democratic-controlled Congress could come up with. And that offends the hell out of me for the following reasons. Anti-Semitism is not the same thing as racism at all. You see, racism started in the United States, at least. Excuse me, my nose itched and I can't stand not scratching it or redoing this just because of a scratched nose. Anyway, it started in the United States because initially they involuntarily imported blacks and rebellious or criminal whites to the British colonies of Georgia and North and South Carolina as a way of first of all, building up their colonies, and second of all, getting rid of troublemaking white people, Scottish and Irish rebels, criminals from England and from Scotland and Ireland came, and they also went to Australia as well. And there were black prisoners of war in Africa from the many tribal wars there that were up for sale, and they paid money and brought them to America. But this was not originally a racist thing. It was just what was done in those days with extra people after a war or after a rebellion or people that you want to get out of the way. In fact, during the Crusades, both the Christians and the Muslims, when they conquered a town, would kill all the men and enslave the women and children as standard operating procedure. So it wasn't racist per se. However, in time, these slaves brought to America had their status changed. They were originally indentured servants. Based on biblical passages, they had them work off the costs of their involuntary transportation to the New World by serving a master for 6 years who paid for their passage. And then they would go free, and they would be free people in a colony of Her or His Majesty, the King or Queen of England. But in time that changed, and increasingly they kept, on various pretexts, blacks as permanent slaves, probably because they were easier to catch if they ran away, because they had the indelible features of Africa, that they were black. And on the other hand, this was a very unjust thing to do. Why didn't they keep the white indentured servants on a permanent basis if they stole a loaf of bread or got into a barroom fight or something? So they came up with the theory of racial superiority to justify that, and that was racism. However, as the colonies gained their independence, and based on their published Declaration of Independence that they believed all men were created equal, the idea of racism and keeping blacks as slaves became very troublesome, because this was an open contradiction, as Frederick Douglass said in his excellent autobiography, where he describes how he went from being an illiterate slave to a highly educated and celebrated free man, an advocate against slavery, that every time the Southern slave owners toast the heroes of the Revolution, he dooms himself. And another former slave, and he was right about that, in the end, rather than following the doctrine of Lloyd Garrison and having all free states secede from the Union rather than be partner to the institution of slavery or complicit in it, instead, the southern states had to secede from the Union to preserve slavery, and some of those states, such as Missouri and Kansas and Delaware and Maryland and Kentucky, didn't even secede. They preferred to stay in the Union and stand on their rights to hold slaves under the Constitution as it was written at that time. Later, after the assassination of Lincoln, the Constitution was amended to abolish slavery. Anyway, I'm getting too far off topic here. Another famous former slave was Booker T. Washington, to whom emancipation came under the Emancipation Proclamation when the Union overran the state of Virginia. And he and his family were declared free and moved to West Virginia. And later he went to the Hampton Institute in Virginia, and then formed his own institute, the Tuskegee Institute, and both the Hampton and the Tuskegee Institute, and this is my point why I got off on the topic of racism, they were based on the idea that teaching former slaves the basics of free living, things that were not important before when they were slaves, such as hygiene and which they were disinclined to do, such as value hard, honest work, because that was believed work was believed to be degradation and the sign of the slave, that they had to work constantly. They changed that paradigm for the former slaves and taught them the value of good work, just as they were teaching them book learning and organized religion and other things which were lacking in the education of slaves. And as a result, Mr. Washington, like Mr. Douglas, became universally respected icons of the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras. And the institutions, the Tuskegee and Hampton institutions, made an indelible change, not only in the attitudes and the status of blacks who used to be slaves, but also of Southern whites who used to look down on slaves. It made great inroads in the paradigms that are used to justify racism. And basically, the method, the strategy used by Mr. Washington and his mentors at Hampton was that if a black man, even though he used to be a slave, can do something better than anyone else, and people need that, they will come to respect him, and in the end, the Jim Crow rules that became in vogue in the 1890s and actually right after slavery ended would eventually fade away. They didn't fade away thanks to a very unfortunate Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, and thanks to the very unfortunate comments of President Woodrow Wilson, who, after he saw the A Birth of a Nation, said what a wonderful movie it was, and that somebody ought to revive the Ku Klux Klan, or words to that effect. I don't think he used quite those words. And the result was what we call in Israel a balagan, a mess, a disaster, a fadicha. I'm not sure where balagan comes from. It's not a Hebrew word, but it's in modern Hebrew, and fadicha is an Arabic word. Anyway, in many respects, however, this paradigm of Booker T. Washington has been proven right, because even in the height of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan in the South in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, blacks were the undisputable leaders in music. Ragtime, blues, jazz, eventually rock and roll, and then rap and R&B and soul were all offshoots of the rhythms and unique vocal quality of black voices and the rhythms that they brought with them on the slave ships from Africa. And it has indelibly changed music all over the world, and especially in America. And the likes of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Count Basie were universally respected in their time, and Louis Armstrong was known as the cultural ambassador of the United States. Likewise, these days, as well as music, blacks are famous athletes and entertainers, and they are respected as such. And it was really a tragedy that Mr. Cosby, who was so loved and respected for most of his life, was brought so low recently when his behavior off screen came to light. But the less said about that, the better. Let's get back to anti-Semitism. Now, let's take Booker T. Washington's paradigm and apply it to Jews. Throughout history, in the ancient times, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, in modern times, many, many Jews have been celebrated as scientists, artists, inventors, advisors to kings and queens and presidents, financiers. But the very opposite of Booker T. Washington's paradigm has applied. We have been hated for our accomplishments, envied, sometimes expelled wholesale, sometimes persecuted, sometimes targeted for annihilation, and not just in isolated incidents or even in very big incidents such as the Holocaust, but throughout the ages. And this is a very different situation than racism. Racism came up very briefly in the period when indentured servants were changed into slaves for life and went from being people of all races who were forcibly transported to the New World to only blacks. And it festered and came worse, and it is still a part of life in the United States, but it had a very recent origin, and it's on the wane for the most part, especially legally, and certainly in people's daily attitudes. The supposed horrible racist Roseanne Barr, for example, in episode 9 of season 7 of her famous television series, dealt with the issue of unconscious racism and how it somehow is manifest. But it was by everybody looked down on and condemned in the subtext of that episode. In this case, however, I'm going to have to continue in a second recording that I'll make shortly, and I'll upload them both tonight. In this case, however, in the case of anti-Semitism, it's become fashionable again. It's been around since ancient Egypt, when the Egyptians got really upset that all these Jews kept on making babies and decided they would deal wisely with them and change their professional brickmaking trade into a compulsory brickmaking trade through taxation. And here I've got to stop and get to my main point about anti-Semitism, because there's still a lot to be said. All I've done so far is differentiate it from racism, and that doesn't suffice. Hang on a moment, and I'll be right back with you.